Beautiful.
Wow.
Has given me over the past 20 years or whatever that we started. They've given me so many opportunities to play and to develop and experiment. You know, giving me that space, giving a lot of artists that space to do that, to grow in music. So I'm really glad to see all of you here to support Arts for Arts because they've really done a lot of work that doesn't really get recognized because we're just out here playing because you don't have a space to play.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, a lot of the things that were fascinating to me were just this issue of your identity, like finding your identity and how that came to be. I had read in an interview you did, I guess, in Downbeat, about how you didn't really even listen to a lot of Chinese music growing up. You saw the occasional, Chinese opera and that kind of thing.
Right.
Same thing with me, by the way. My mother was Chinese, and we were talking about how my mother came from China, just as your parents did.
Right.
So I'm trying to figure out how you came from a background where maybe you weren't exposed to as much Chinese music, and in fact went to film school ultimately, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to music. And how did you get from there, from point A to point B? And I think that's the only question I have to ask. If you answer it in detail, you know pretty much the whole story.
Well, my parents,
When you speak, could you slow down?
Slow down, okay. It's so funny, people usually say speak louder, okay, so louder and then slower, okay. I'll try.
Well, my parents had 4 kids. I have 3 older sisters. And my father came here in 1945 under a Boxer Rebellion scholarship. And my mother came with the last American troops in '48. And so that was still, different levels of the exclusion law still existed. So my father came when I think only 100 Chinese were allowed into the country.
Wow.
And because he had a scholarship. My mother came in because just like now, there's a lot of immigration restrictions. You know, you had to have a bank account, you had to have a job and all that. And my father's bosses created a bank account to fulfill every aspect of it, you know. But it was still kind of brutal. I remember my mother said the Americans in China, to get your visa, they made all the women strip and stand there while these guys walked around deciding whether they'd let them through. So, so my parents didn't, at least by the time I was born, 4 kids and no extended family, no daycare and all that. My mother was probably going quite nuts, you know, taking care of us. And so they didn't really play music. You know, we'd go to Chinese opera, which is strange, or you know, they'd listen to Doris Day at Sullivan or something like that. So I always wondered, like, well, how, you know, where did my music come from? And I think, like, my oldest sisters were bilingual, but they had so many problems in school, you know, just understanding the teacher and such. So when I was born, and this was the era of the American melting pot, in which, you know, minority people are supposed to just, you know, let go of their ethnicity and melt into American culture. So the idea of me just speaking English seemed right to them for me to make my way in this country. So, but of course they spoke Chinese to each other. And so I always thought my first musical experience was trying to figure out what they were saying. You know, because Chinese is such a tonal language, there's inflection, there's pitch, there's cadence to it. And I was listening to it as music because I was trying to glean any type of meaning, especially when they're talking about me, right? So, you know, and I'd listen to that. So, you know, I think as far as identity, in a way, we construct our identities. And so, whether it's active imagination or not, that's what I think is one source of my musical identity.
Just the sound of the language. I remember
Sound of the language.
Talked about it. Yeah,
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, it's very cool. My mother, and again, I can say this because I'm Chinese or half Chinese, she used to say that she couldn't imagine somebody speaking Chinese who was sort of tone deaf because you have to have this perfect, you know, sense of ups and downs. So I can see what you mean about the musicality of the language.
But my father's name is Hwang Kao, and it was romanized K-A-O under that phonetic system of the time. And so, but everyone called him Kao. I mean, it was spelled, because they wouldn't say Gao, they would say Kao. So then he was called Kao, and that's my middle name. So.
Oh, there you go. My name is Didi, which means little brother in Chinese, but I have a cousin named Didi, who I met recently. But, you know, in terms of the film school thing also versus the presumption that you would take, you know, formal lessons and study, where did the actual physical ability to play on such a high level with this very classically oriented technique and all of that, did you study as a kid? Or
yeah, you know, there was the music programs in the schools, which only a few places in the country have music programs in the school these days. But back then it was kind of common. So, you know, I was taking it from 3rd grade on.
Okay.
And then when I came to here to go to school at NYU, I wasn't the most focused person in the world, you know, and I went over to St. Mark's Place, and there was the East Side bookstore, and I saw a flyer, and this is when St. Mark's had nothing there except no stores except some secondhand clothes stores, and the Hells Angels had like a hair cutting place next to the bookstore. I got my hair cut there once. And I just remember the smell of Bazooka bubblegum. Anyway, I saw a flyer and it said Basement Workshop, Asian American organization for a poetry workshop. And I never saw those two words put together before, Asian American, you know. And so I said, well, that's me.
Right.
So I went there. They had their space over at 199 Lafayette. And it was the first time I met other Asian Americans who, where English was their first language. And we had some common experiences. And Basement Workshop was a multi-arts organization. It really is, you know, in the years it's now studied as one of the cultural centers for Asian American thinking, and you know, it was a feeling of gaining your empowerment. You know, first our history wasn't written. There was I think there was only one book about Asian American history. There were no novelists. You never saw an Asian American on TV unless you saw like Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. You know. Right, you know. And so, and then we were also coming off 3 wars against Asian countries, you know, from, you know, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And I remember as a kid, Vietnam vets at the train station, you know, and there'd be sometimes be kind of nutty talking about killing gooks, and you know, and I'm just sitting there waiting for my train, and you know, they would look at me, and I'd feel kind of uncomfortable, you know. So that was kind of the backdrop for an organization that was saying that, you know, this is a space of empowerment, which means, you know, basically when you're rendered invisible, becoming visible, and creating your identity on your own terms, not from mass media, and expressing yourself in a way that is true. And so I would go to Basement, and I met Will Connell Jr. There, the alto saxophone, reeds player, composer, and he brought me into the music scene. You know, we played at the Ladies Ford on Bond, which was Joe Lee Wilson's loft. I think that was our very first gig, and I made $20, which let me buy a hand cart so I could haul my amp around. I remember that, with Jay Oliver, the late Jay Oliver. And,
exactly 1 block away.
Yeah, I know. But the music, and Will brought me into the scene, a lot of the values of the music embraced or was consistent with the same thinking and the same type of movement that was going on at Basement Workshop. And coming from different sources, but the music gave me a place in which I could find out who I am, you know.
So were you, I don't want to backtrack too much, but I'm just curious, were you sort of searching for something and then you felt like you sort of found it then? Where did the film school thing come in? Like, was that something you were really pursuing actively and thinking that that's what I'm going to go into?
Yeah.
I'm just curious about that. Just
I
as
wasn't
somebody
the
who's
most
raised
focused
for media.
18-year-old, you know. I mean, it
was more like that.
It
Yeah.
didn't have a real professional
Yeah, but it got you
track
to
in
New York,
mind.
which was good.
But I get in New York, I liked film, and I had no idea what it was like as a profession or anything. But I was going to film school. I'd go to Basement Workshop, and I started playing the jam session where I met Will. And then that drew me into the whole loft jazz scene where then I met William Parker and Patricia and started playing. Butch Morris came to, I think, our very first gig, right? And so I started playing in different groups. And for film, you know, that I made a film that took me like, I don't know, six years to finish, and it was called Afterbirth. And it was a lot of the ideas that Will and I would talk about, and we'd talk about a basement, about identity, and in the film there's an African-American man speaking fluent Mandarin saying, I'm Chinese, I was born in China. And then there is a Caucasian woman said, yes, you know, we grew up together, and they're speaking fluent Mandarin. I heard them talking in a cafe, and I thought that was pretty interesting. You know, but the whole idea of ethnicity, is it learned? Or is it genetic, or is it spiritual? And so I was exploring, trying to parse exactly all those layers, because we deal with that all the time. I think as musicians, ethnicity, my Chinese face is there, you know, and it affects people's perceptions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing that we always contend with. I know, like in a lot of thinking now, they try to think that racialized thinking is passé, and
Right.
that, you know, that there's something, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's all about the quality of the music, and you know, and you could say yes and no, because I was reading The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Zen of Motorcycle Maintenance, and he talked about, well, you know, I related to this racialized thinking is like you got different piles of sand. People think that's what it's about, different piles of sand. Then non-racialized thinking is like you're just looking at the sand. You know, the sand is the sand, you know. But the real perception is the landscape, you know, which has the sand and the piles of the sand. And so you can't look at things in an ahistorical way, because the music comes from life, you know, not from the intellectual constructs. So
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that was the other thing that struck me about you pursuing your own identity. I grew up in Canada, where I always felt more Canadian than anything. And you know, I did write an opera that was sort of Chinese influence, but it seems like the vast body of your work has been exploring this issue of what it means to be Asian American. I mean, you've done a lot of good things, but is that
you know, it's always there. I mean, if a presenter at a festival gives me a gig, except for Patricia, you know, especially in Europe, where they don't have a lot of experience with different minorities. You know, my ethnicity is going to be a factor in whether they're going to book me. And what's really interesting is how people contend with it, because, you know, there's almost a demand for the performance of that ethnicity. You know, whether how I dress, or the names of my songs, there are people looking because they're associating the different physical appearance with representing coming from a different place. And then that can become a novelty or a sense of exoticism, and people will pay a ticket to experience something that they don't understand. It's like, I don't know what that is, that's novel, or that's ethnic, I don't know what that is, what is that, you know? But, you know, being Asian American has like very little political cachet, I think. In that, And that's, yeah, I don't know, but
But did you ever, it seems weird to go one step further, but did you ever like resent the fact that people were characterizing you that way or expecting you to be away and want to just do something, you know, without it necessarily having this sort of presumed Asian influence? I'm just curious.
yeah, well, I know that those expectations are there. I mean, I wrote an opera in 2001, The Floating Box, the story in Chinatown, and that was the first time I totally wrote something, and it took me like 6-year project from having the crazy idea to doing it, you know. And that had Chinese instruments, and my idea of orchestration for that would have the erhu and the pipa, which is the lute, and the Chinese fiddle and the lute, and that had bass clarinet, B-flat clarinet, you know, flute, piccolo, alto flute, vibraphone, percussion, and cello, and cast of 3. And my idea for the orchestration was like, well, if I just went up to the orchestra and said, just play a note, anything, would that be the sound of location, of this experience and these characters and the story? So then I realized, like, my more recent octet, Burning Bridge, which also has pipa and erhu, I kind of think of that sound as like my parents' voice, you know. There are these, in the overtones of the whole sound, there are elements of traditional Chinese sounds. And when you're orchestrating, you know, oftentimes, just any kind of orchestration, you're looking for bridges of timbre between instruments and how they meld and how they diverge. And with Chinese instruments, it's really interesting because, like, the erhu is very reedy, and you can blend it with clarinet or whatever, and it'll sound like a reed. But then when it plays with me, it sounds like a string. So it had this sort of timbral kind of pivot that made it part of both sections. It could be a kind of a kaleidoscope type thing going on. With the timbres. But I think whenever I use Chinese instruments in my music, for me there is always a kind of a biographical resonance to it, you know. I mean, it's a more literal thing, I guess, you know. But as far as the people's expectations, yeah, you know, I think for the music, it's about breaking down barriers,
right,
and getting closer to people.
Right.
The music industry, for you to become an entity, you need to remove yourself and from people and create that distance, which someone would pay $50 to go hear you play, because they don't want to hear someone that's just like them on stage. They want to hear someone who's, you know, something, you know. So, but it's counterintuitive to me, because that's not the purpose of the music for me. The purpose is to break down barriers and share yourself and your humanity.
So there is that.
There is
potential that people will see you that way.
Yeah.
See, I didn't have that problem because people are like, "What the heck are you?" And, you know, people walk up to me and talk in Spanish. And
you're the future citizen, man.
Hey, post-racial. Now you mentioned your opera, which again I listened to it. There's a wonderful video of, I think, an excerpt from the session. Like just a little. You have your entire Symphony of Souls on there, which shouldn't preclude people from buying the recorded version, but I have to say it's amazing to see the actual performance of that as well. But as far as the opera, what struck me was, and I read, I think, that you had said it was almost entirely notated, right?
Yeah.
With the exception of the percussion. And some
percussion was notated too.
Oh, even that? Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you had said at some point that some of that was improvised or something. So, I guess I'm trying to think of how to formulate the question. It's really more me marveling at the fact that you have this ability to truly deal with both of those worlds, from what we just saw now, which I'm sure had a tremendous amount, if not entirely, was improvised, to stuff that is entirely notated, to things in between.
That opera was thick, freaking killed me.
So where did they come from? Did you study, not that this would have necessarily helped, in fact, perhaps it would have been a hindrance, but did you study formally composition, or how did you learn to do
it? You know, it was pure hell, you know.
Because did you use conventional notation? Well,
I use conventional notation, but you know, I am self-taught, and so it was truly working on something till it sounded right, and if I had more skills then I probably could, well, who knows what I would do. But you know, at that time it was purely instinct. So, you know, I'm talking about the kind of work you put in. It would take me about 30 hours to write, you know, 24 measures, and then it would take me another 10 hours to orchestrate it. And this is for an hour and a half work, so it took about 8 months of daily work, which I was blessed with a grant that supported me. But the first 3 months, everything I wrote, I threw away. So, you know, I just had to use my instinct until I got it. And then once I cracked it, then started to go. But I think the difference between, written and composed,
Like what made you want
there
to
is a
do
lot
it?
of schools. I've been hearing a lot of groups where like some jazz bands, it's like 90% written, and it's so perplexing. I thought, don't they want to play? I mean, I thought it was fun to play.
Right.
But for me, the writing, it's like a different energy field,
Right.
and it's just, especially write for improvisation, I tend to write for what's essential that will liberate the improviser to take that idea and move, And so, but otherwise, it's a different energy field. Like there's certain emotional territories that only improvisation can touch. And there's certain things when you compose that create the relationships of all the instruments that can only be done through writing,
Right. And with
So
vocal,
for the
with
opera,
lyrics too, as
the
well.
only reason, there was a time when Anthony Davis had done his opera X at City Opera, which was like totally inspired people. Philip Glass was doing his early operas, and so everyone was going, wow, what an amazing form. I mean, a lot of my friends when they hear operatic voices, they turn green in their stomach, and they go, But I think operatic voices they are tremendous. But so that was in the air, and I played in Henry Threadgill's oratorio with BAM when he was working on one. I played in Butch Morris's Modette, which was never finished, was a musical he was working on. Deidre Murray was doing musical theater. So out of this scene of jazz, there's a lot of people, I think from Anthony Davis and Philip Glass, that were doing these larger ensemble type pieces. So being a sideman in those projects, it sparked my imagination, and I thought I'd like to try that.
Yeah, but they had, at least even in X, there was still improvisation, or there was some.
There's some, yeah.
There was like a little mini group within it. or
Right,
something.
right.
Yeah, so I'm still struck by the fact that you chose to.
It was also a time, sometimes you got to inspire yourself. That's a whole new vista for me.
So you thought this was an interesting.
And that I got funding for it without having, it was amazing I got funding, honestly, because, I had a body of work, but not for that.
Right.
So I was very, very lucky that someone believed in me and said, let him try that.
Right.
And, so it was a new vista. And I have to say that Crucible, of those 8-9 months where I wrote 10 hours a day and went through all that, because there's a lot of pressure too, because it was going to open and there should be something there on the music stand,
Right. Nothing like a good deadline, right? I don't need time, I need a deadline.
Yeah.
Duke Ellington.
Our first rehearsal was the week after 9/11, and we couldn't even get the subways to where we were going to rehearse, and everybody was just so devastated. We just talked for the first hour and a half.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But then, writing for voice is very, every voice is its own school. Every singer's got different experiences, how they read, where they like their comfort of their voice. So after I wrote it, every rehearsal I was rewriting it because I wanted them to be successful to sing it. I wanted them to feel comfortable. And so I started learning more about their voices. So I have to say that 9 months was my graduate school, where I taught myself
That's fantastic.
more about orchestration.
What a way to achieve that. That's amazing. So you were writing with their voices in mind ultimately after hearing it.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to writing a voice that is how they get to notes. And
Yeah. Well, what about a project like your Symphony of Souls, which again that's what it's called. I've had this fear of I'm not looking at my cheat sheet here, so I'm saying the wrong Symphony of Hearts or something. But there's this wonderful video that people can check out if you haven't of the actual recording session, right?
Yeah.
It's just all done in one big massive tape of like 80 minutes long. But what struck me was, again, the complete seamless transitions between what had to just by the power of deduction be notated sections, and just completely improvised sections.
Yeah.
And I think you had written about the fact, for example, that you would learn things from your work with Butch Morris and the conduction techniques. So maybe you could talk a bit about how you again managed to bridge those two worlds and literally go from one to the other in a way that you couldn't even tell you were doing it, and so on.
Well, I think I did learn a lot from Butch. At the time, I was pissed at him, so I didn't think I learned a lot from Butch.
Well, let's talk about it. Come on, let's go there.
That's all right.
That's okay. You can tell me.
We're fine. We were fine, But I remember playing with him at Billy Bang's memorial, and I saw how he conducted, and I thought, he did a lot to shape how I hear, because I played with him like 20, since I was 22 or something.
Did you ever do when he was conducting the big bands at the Knitting Factory?
Yeah.
I did some of those.
No, this was right after with David
This was like
Murray.
in the 90s.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I was.
Oh, you were
here
that?
10
Okay.
years. Like I think I'm about 10 years younger than you. So I
Okay.
kind of came.
Okay, yeah, yeah. But Symphony Souls, it was 38 string players. It was about 8 bass players, 14 violins, 8 violas, 8 guitars, traps, and we totaling 38. And we got Systems 2 for about 5 hours. We did 2 complete takes and CDs the second take. But it's my exploration of orchestral improvisation, and there's all these possibilities. Like if you think of a sound of an orchestra, maybe you'll have a 10-note chord that's voiced through the orchestra, you know. But if you have 38 musicians, you could have a 38-note chord. And then people say, well, that's atonal, or that's not something. But what happens in the piece, you know, it's like the music is a tree, and then you hear each leaf moving, you know. So you see the tree, and then you have this shimmer of the sound of 38 individuated voices. And then when I would write something, I could like focus that into like 5 or 6 note voice chords, or 4 contrapuntal lines, or something like that, you know. So it's sort of like the colors and the possibilities of that flow. So you know, what I learned from Butch was, you know, he had always developed his language of conduction, and some of them they're simple, like, you know, cut off or a downbeat. But for strings, you know, it's very mime-like, tremolo, pizz, collegno, you know, or a sustained note. I would give them a I would say, if you want to move up a whole step, you know, I'd go like that, and they would bring it up a block chord. I would say playing a note, it's a chord, bring it up whole step, bring it down a half step, bring it up a minor third, and so that everyone could do that, and that's how I got harmonic movement going, and found ways of which things like that could go into work within the score, which had like about 15 passages, and I would trial and error. First I was trying to use all my fingers, but no one could, how many fingers are there? So I just used 5 fingers, and then I went, you know, heart 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then that's how I got 15. I was able to get 15. Yeah, that's how I got my 15.
Yeah. Here's the next one.
Yeah,
that's amazing. Were those, I mean, the thing I found about Butch's stuff, and I've done some of his music as well here and there in the context of David Murray's big band.
Yeah.
And just not so much that context, but hearing the other projects he's done around the world, was it often seemed like the end result was dependent just upon the not entirely, but in part at least upon the abilities of also the improvisers. Like if you had people who could really improvise, then it was going to be at a whole other level, despite how great Butch was at anything. Did you find that too? Like, were these players in this project all improvisers?
Yeah. I mean, there's people from you know, from the New York Phil, from what's the name of that orchestra? I forgot this chamber orchestra. So there's some classical people, there's some bluegrass people, there's a Carnatic violinist, there was people who are from bluegrass and jazz. And it's all about all those languages being able to be empathetic towards each other, and to give them space to play the way they play, you know. So Butch was very brilliant because he brought together really diverse people. I mean, you would go to a rehearsal and you would see this room, and like you wouldn't see how it would work because everyone was from completely different backgrounds, you know. Yeah. But what was interesting, when I went to Korea the first time in the early 90s with Kao Hwang, I went to a rehearsal, Salon, and it's interesting the zeitgeist of the time, because I looked in the room and they had this people from the Seoul Philharmonic and Salon, and there's a Buddhist pianist. I mean, people that were totally of different worlds, and they were trying to make a piece together. And I thought, they don't know Butch, they're not following what's going on in New York. So there was like a pretty thing, like sometimes there's a zeitgeist and it's traveling around the world where people are trying to do that.
Yeah.
But speaking of language, when I went to Korea, like you know, you try to learn a few words like thank you, and I would say, how do you say thank you? Komapsanita. But by the end of the week, and no one spoke English at all to me. It was kind of crazy. I was the only one in my entourage who spoke English. I started saying it faster. I was saying Tomapsanita, you know, instead of ko. And so I go to the airport, and the guy drops me off, and I said Tomapsanita. He goes, what? I said, thank you. And he said, no, you're saying I have no money. So now I'm thinking back at the end of the concert, and people in their best English going, "Thank you for the concert." I'm going, "I have no money."
Have some mercy.
So,
Some money.
oh man, language is dangerous. I mean, it's like, wow, the whole week I've been saying this.
Well, let me change gears a little bit, and I want to allow people to ask questions too, but I can't help but ask a couple more, if it's okay. Just the role of your thoughts on the role of education, because you, as you say, were sort of self-taught in a way, although I hate that term, because you could go to school and study with the same people that you happen to have studied with as mentors out in the world. It doesn't really matter. And somehow you've arrived where you are, and it doesn't really matter. But since then, I've read that you've been teaching formally on occasion in university and doing various courses and so on. So what are your thoughts on the value of that and the usefulness of that, the importance of that?
Well, you know, what's interesting now, probably across the board in the arts, is I guess it's always been that kind of march where the level of technical virtuosity is getting, higher and higher. And I think there's a greater disjunction between, say, a musician that's 25 and myself than I was looking to people that are 20 years older than me. And part of it is, I think, how we're learning. For example, before you would wait for a great artist to come into town and maybe you'd watch them play a concert. You'd see them maybe, twice a year, and you'd watch them and you'd try to figure out, well, how do you do that, and then you go home and you try to figure out how to play. But now with YouTube, you can watch great performances constantly. It's always there.
And hear all music, basically.
Yeah.
Spotify and whatever.
Right, and so that aspect of learning, which is emulation, is much more powerful now, and so and also the rise of jazz education. Jazz education, it's part of all Western education. You have to deal with something tangible. I mean, so much of music is intangible, but to make it tangible, you make method books. You have degree programs, you have tests in which you get an A and all that type of thing. You make this tangible structure, So when I teach, I try to put people into, so what happens is from that process, I think, and not for all, there's always people that there has been some feeling where you master the menu, but you don't know what food is. And so the virtuosity of the menu is there and you listen to it, but it's about food. So that's what I think is a little bit different than like when Lester Young was with Count Basie, and he would be playing on the bus for 6-8 hour bus rides, and everyone's like trying to survive these grueling conditions, and they would jam on the bus. But he figured it out. It wasn't about emulation. He figured it out. So I think. Somehow our education is going to have to probably, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. I can't say all of education is like that, but it's changed. There's been a culture shift there, and so one thing I do is, if you guys are game for it, is I would always, my wife and I went to a yoga retreat, and they had a laughing meditation, and we laughed for like a half hour, right? And you start listening to everyone laugh, and like, everyone's laugh is totally unique, right? So I would like us to laugh, like say for 10 seconds, and everybody listen to your laugh and listen to how people are laughing like it's music, and then we'll talk about it for a second. So you ready?
I need a great joke. Come on, somebody.
Here you go.
It's infectious, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So the model is, your laugh is unique, and when you listen to people laugh, sometimes there's sadness and happiness at the same time, and it makes your laugh makes so much sense for your personality, Like you hear your friend laugh, you go, that's that person. So then there's evidence then that we have a unique voice, and that I think of that playing music. If I could play music, my laughter, because when you laugh, also what's really funny is you laugh with total conviction. You don't think about it. You're in the moment completely, and you're just involved in that act of laughter. And so I thought, if you could perform like that, where you're just like into the depth of each moment in that way, then, then that's like the truth of your laughter. Because in our voices are the vibrations of our history. I think, Hazrat Inayat Khan would talk about vibrations as everything. It's the color, it's the temperature, it's our voices. But most interesting, it's our emotions and our history. So if you go into a room and it feels sad and you don't know why, there's these vibrations there. So the way I started thinking when I was reading about the law of conservation of energy, which says, energy is neither created nor destroyed, I thought, wow, the implications for music is amazing. That means every note ever played, every word ever spoken is still here, And then the musician's job is then to bring it back into the vibrant world, So when you think of history that way, it's very interesting. All these vibrations are still here, and some of them come back into the vibrant world, and they cause movements of history, and then they dissipate into another energy, and then they come back. And it kind of makes sense, even like, I react to certain emotional situations, probably like my mother, or I have, do this like my father, and you don't know why. And so this idea of vibrations that are never destroyed, and I think so that musicians that bring that into sound.
Yeah, it's funny, speaking of laughter, because you had me smiling at times with your solo today. I mean in a good way. Don't get me wrong. When you were doing the wah-wah thing, and it felt like a manic, schizophrenic conversation. I saw you smiling too at that point. There was some moment. So it's even directly viewed in your music. Let me ask one question, one more, if that's okay, and then I want to turn it over to everybody else. I feel like a student, like, oh, is it okay, or a child. I read that you, somebody had commented on how well you write, basically, as an actual writer, like writers to CDs, and you had made a point about how, at some point in the past, you've made this point, I've read about that can be a useful tool as an artist to clarify, your own ideas. And I find that too as a teacher, the same idea, that, being able to express, especially music that's more adventurous, being able to, as you say, I don't want to say systematize it, but being able to somehow quantify and explain what you're going for on some level can be valuable. So, and this is a left field question, but have you ever thought of like blogging or anything like that? Or
writing is so painful for me.
Yeah, I find the same thing, but everyone is always saying, hey, get out there, and maybe this music can get out there that way. So I'm curious if that would be...
Well, I think Patricia has these salons because she's trying to help people understand the music and the musicians that make it. And I think it's always a good skill if you can find a way to articulate your vision. But what's interesting to me is like, the conditions for creativity are different now because we try to get grants. And I write a grant, it's just so agonizing, and put it through. And then if you get funding, you have funding for your music. And that we have to explain the music first and then fulfill it is a process that's affecting the music of our times. When you think about so much great music we heard, if we heard Miles Davis, what on earth would he write for a grant proposal? So I was reading, I heard an amazing interview of Ronald Shannon Jackson in 1985 that someone sent me, and he talked about his experiences at Albert Island, and he said, Albert saw ghosts, and he said, you might think that it's kind of weird, but he said actually a lot of people, shamans and all that, they tune themselves so that they see the other world, and he said, Albert saw ghosts, and he was making music with them. And I thought, like, how do you apply to the NEA for that,
I saw some ghosts and
yeah. So, now, there's other thing too with the public, because I went to this talk with these presenters, and they're not the bad guys, but they said, well, you can't just be a musician and play your own music and expect people to come hear you.
I've been told that too.
He says, well, like so-and-so did a whole project about Miles Davis, and look how great that is. Another guy did The Sidemen of Art Blakey, and people came to that. And I was thinking, I didn't want to embarrass him. I thought, well, wasn't Miles Davis just a guy playing his own music?
But it's a different age, right? It's YouTube.
So even the framing of presenting, like I said, they're not the bad guys. They're the guys that presented an artist playing their own music that didn't draw and they lost money. And so they're putting the onus like, well, you can't just do that. You got to have some type of hook to sell tickets. So all these things are affecting the music of our times, you know, including this idea of having to write out your thought of what the music is, and then apply for funding, and then doing it. We're being put through a funnel. And,
yeah, for better or for worse, really.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my final question then would be, I can't help myself, I'm sorry. You guys can leave, we'll just keep talking. No, but how do you, what is your perception of the importance of getting this sort of music, however we want to define it, more adventurous music and open-minded music, out there to the broader public? There's always this talk of it being not so much elitist, but just having an inherently narrow audience. Do you think it's important that it get propagated further?
Well, that brings us to Arts for Arts, because because Patricia is always thinking of ways of how to present this music to the public. You know, the Salon is about that, and getting the conversations going, the meetings that she calls. She gets us all thinking about it. We don't have any of the answers, but collectively, you know, we struggle with it. I mean, for me, as a musician, you know, the main thing is you try to tune yourself to a higher and higher level of vibration to create, you know, and then let that speak for itself. That's what I have control over.
Right.
You know, whether the world wants to see the performance of ethnicity, or they want to see a certain kind of personality, or that sort of thing. That's perplexing to me. I mean, I'm kind of aware of it. People put that sort of thing together, and some people that works, and that's who they are. And so, you know, you just put out who you are, and then what happens, you know, you just keep, but you got to keep your growth going forward. And be true to yourself. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you certainly have achieved that.
Well, thanks.
So thank you. So I guess you want to, yes, questions? Anybody in the audience, or want to follow up with anything? Now that I've exhausted everybody.
Yeah. So I was wondering, sort of going along the lines of what you were talking about with applying for grants and how you have to sort of shape yourself into that. So how is that connected to what you were talking about with having to perform a certain identity? And I guess along the same lines, do you feel that you have opportunities to explore your identity and ethnicity and history within that sort of forced performance?
I'm going to talk about the perception and the exterior, because it's always to me about that for everything I play, because it's just like our laughter, right? The history is there, the intent is there. You know, music, it's interesting, I'm reading this book on rituals. And so if you think of music as a ritual of truth, aspiring to be that truth, it's interesting. So you like the act of saying thank you is a ritual about thanks. But it is also, the act of it is thanks, right? So I think that the music too is a ritual about truth, seeking to become that truth. And that's, you know, basically the process. As far as presenting myself for each project, I don't try to form it doesn't work for me to form a persona to the public where, you know, I have some type of novelty or something. You know, I mean, some people are into self-mythologizing, and it's amazing to me. They make their way into the world, into society in a certain way, because I would think, God, I would never do that, and then it worked.
That's sort of what social media is about these days.
Self-mythologizing?
Well, selective honesty, if anything. I did a seminar recently where somebody was talking about this, a successful film composer, and it was like, you want to get your personality out there, but not all of your personality.
I got
nothing that's
attacked
controversial, nothing, you know.
I got attacked on Facebook once, so I'm not...
You're like, I forget that.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that.
So any other... Yeah.
I was talking to my friend Will here about the way you draw the bow over the string. And of course I heard you do it a lot. And it never sounds the same. You could have one note that has so many sounds by the time you've drawn the bow completely over the string. It's unpredictable. And I was saying, I know that requires a constant level of skill. Like some of it is just sheer technical skill, but it goes so way beyond that. And I found myself saying, when he draws the bow across the string, something goes on with him. So that's what I'd be curious if you could describe what that something is.
Well, you know, the thing about technique, I really studied, I mean, later in life, I studied the violin pedagogy. You know, earlier when I started playing, you didn't want to do that, you know, because going through that is like your sound is getting colonized, you know, playing in tune or something like that. Well, whose tuning is that, you know, and all that. But, you know, and I still kind of believe in that type of freedom. But then I went back to the violin pedagogy and started, you know, going myself. And it's painful because then, you know, you do that and you don't do it too well, right? That's the whole thing about getting better, is you got to confront what you can't do. And so I was practicing really slowly these exercises, right? And to me, it becomes more about the physics of the instrument. So if you want to play, say, perfectly in tune, it makes it ring a certain way, you know. And then if you want to play it in between pitches, it's a different kind of a ring to the physics of this string length and body size, you know. So I started, but then if you have your relaxation, right, that you get from, you know, violin technique that was basically established in the early 19th century, you know, with the French. I mean, you know, some of that is just about how to get your hands to relax and do what you want to do. And then you can go from there. So you don't have to do that. I don't think anyone has to do that. But I chose to do that because I felt I got stuck somewhere. And so I was looking for things to practice, you know, and I took a few lessons and so I started working on that. So I'm always looking for something to practice that, you know what I mean, just...
When was that, when you...
I think about eight years ago I started.
Oh, really? So very relatively recently.
Yeah.
Well, your intonation is impeccable.
Oh, well, thanks.
Struck by that as well.
It's on a good day.
No, that's why I thought, wow, this feels like a very classically trained thing in that sort of stereotypical way.
Yeah, but, you know, I'm not...
In terms of, you know, chops,
Yeah.
quote unquote, you know.
Maybe, but you know, I mean, the violinists I worked with, they went and got their master's degree, you know, they learned the repertoire, and I don't know, you know, I'm not going to play the late Beethoven string quartets or anything like that.
You've been there, done it. Yeah, it's been done.
Yeah, but that's the other thing, if you go through the school and you have to get an A, like, you know, if you have your vibrato trained for that type of bel canto operatic voice thing, right, it becomes muscle memory. And if you, then you don't know how to get out of it. So to me, that I learned it kind of late is I don't have that muscle memory of like, that's the way you make a note sing. I mean, I just have my hand relaxed so I can do that, you know.
You can hear that.
Yeah.
You're the best of both
Yeah, but I
worlds.
probably, if I was forced to play Mendelssohn or something like that, I would probably do something weird.
I came up as a classical pianist, and that's definitely what I did. You know, I enjoyed all my teachers.
It is something, yeah.
First off, you know, thank you for sharing yourself and your music with us, and your story also.
Hey.
What is it about the violin that allows you to express yourself more than another instrument? And if you were to choose another instrument, what would you choose?
Oh, wow.
And
That's
how
a
did you
good
choose the
question.
violin? That's the question.
Oh, you know, it was like I was a third grader and I wanted to play trumpet and my parents thought, oh, I don't think we want to play trumpet. That's a loud one, no. So, you know, at the time when I was a kid and chose the instrument, it just was fun. Hopefully it's still fun. If I play another instrument, actually, out of all the saxophones, I like the soprano because it's the most difficult instrument for a saxophonist to play. It's the most wild. And those that attempt to tame its wildness don't sound good to me. The classical saxophone playing, but the ones that keep the wild thing in it, I kind of like that horn. Yeah, but I never really thought about playing another instrument. I know William tries to, he gives me little gifts, encouraging me to play other instruments. He gave me this little Hungarian fiddle, and you know, and I haven't really gotten into it because he's amazing. He was picking a trumpet, tuba, and you know, all sorts of instruments.
Well, it's interesting that the other instrument you cited is in the same pitch range.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, I remember when David Baker, who I studied with in Indiana when I was doing the classical stuff, when he was unable to play the trombone anymore, he went to the cello. Right? Which is again the same. So maybe here.
No, I like my viola. I just started playing viola about
okay.
8 years ago too. When did I get my viola? 2003 or something like that. So a little while.
Yeah,
Viola gets that out of my system.
But no cello or
no cello.
Okay. Yeah. So high pitched person.
So why do you think? What is this? Can you talk a little more about why and what free jazz was, and why it happened, when it happened, and sort of, and what happened to it?
Well, you know, when I met Will was coming out of the experience of a collective from Horace Tapscott. And then we were in the context of Basement, which was an Asian American collective. So there was a great spirit to that music, and listening to music could change the world, you know. And it's actually quite true, you know. There's physiological effects of vibration. I mean, the easiest thing is like certain pitches will trigger your fight or flight mode like an alarm. But that's kind of proof that there's a physiological impact of sound on you. And then how you hear also changes you. If you met someone, a stranger, and you dig the same music and you talk about that music, you got a bond like right away, you know. So the more, when I would play different music when I'm teaching, because I said the more kind of music that you can accept, the more type of people you can accept. If you go around thinking that music sounds awful and strange, then, you know, the people playing the music will seem awful and strange, you know. So it's about, you know, that sort of thing. But other than that, you know, when I heard Leroy Jenkins play his solo concert at Washington Square Church, I just never heard anyone play the violin like that in his own way. And so that also was like really inspiring. I heard Billy later.
Why? What was it about that time? Yeah. What was it about it for you? What was it saying? What was it doing? What was it meaning? And how does that relate to what's going on?
Well, you know, it was about finding your own voice, like your laughter, to be true to yourself, to speak it through your own experiences. And once you have that, then you are empowered. And like I said, at that time, especially for the Asian American community, it's after 3 Asian wars. It's like after the Tin Pan Alley, Yellow Peril stereotypes from the 40s, from Fu Manchu to Mickey Rooney and Breakfast at Tiffany's and all that, those type of images. And so at that age, and all that stuff pissed me off, you know. And a lot of us got teased a lot. I was looking through my father's things after he passed, and I saw these flyers when he retired. And it had all these chinky little things, you know, and they people that loved him, you know. But that's how they thought. That was what the era they grew up in, like, you know, Confucius says go to this, you know, all this type of bullshit. So the music was like about, when I say bring people closer, it's about presenting yourself as a human being, and there was a great deal, I think, of racial differences that I think it's changed. It has changed a lot. But people, often when I was a kid, we were the only two families that were Chinese in the whole town. In fact, I remember my father was driving through the town, he saw another Chinese person. They got so freaked out, they beat their horns at each other. And then they went to the parking lot, and they found they didn't speak the same dialect. You know? He spoke Cantonese, my father's Mandarin, you know. I was thinking like, man, that's serious isolation.
Right.
You know. So a lot of us at Basement, whether it was Faye and Jeannie up in Queens, and we all experienced that stuff, and that made us angry. I saw a talk of Tiwa Chang, the newscaster, and he said that when he was out of college, he had a videotape, his demo tape, and he was sending it to station managers trying to get a gig, and he couldn't get one. And so he went back to University of Pennsylvania, and to his teacher said, well, look at my tape, I mean, what am I doing wrong? He says, Tiwa, you don't understand, you know, this producer's got like 150 tapes. He pops your tape in, he sees your face and says, Japanese spy, he pops it out, and you're not gonna get the job. So, I don't know how he got his break. It was one producer that gave him a job that essentially he's employed him his whole life, because Tiwa's kind of a wild candidate. He gets fired, apparently. And this guy hires him and moves from network to network.
Like Keith Olbermann,
yeah. So, you know, but he said at the time of his career, between the Boston and the Washington market, there's only 2 Asian American men on air, him and this Arthur Hwang, who got fired for cursing at some heckler on camera. I was funny.
It's a good reason.
But that was it. But there was like about exponentially more Asian American women that all had the haircut of Kaidi Tong, you know, and it played into the perception of ethnicity, that the Asian American women were nice and warm and supportive,
Right.
and all that, you know, and so that was a friendly face there. So that was more the environment now. And actually, you know, even though it's different outwardly there, I mean, we could see, like, you know, how racism manifests itself all I mean, even so much of this, the far right wing now, I mean, it's pretty obvious, you know, that no one should relax their guard or anything. But I think that's what the music, I felt gave me my mission in life, you know, was to present our humanity, you know, in being true to ourselves. Yeah.
While I was listening to your pieces of that was presented this evening, I could see different parts of the music, the component, the way you reached its sound. And that made me think about poetry. When a poet, write a poem, he or she chooses the right word to give it the structure to the sound and the poetry. So the question is that when you're performing and do a specific sound, either you pitch the high, middle, or low, whether your body physically experience the emotional thing, or are you trying to convey something political in the sound that you're projecting with the instrument? Because I mean, I hear you talk about ethnicity, how to identify yourself with others, and also talking about empowerment. So when you play, when you do a specific pitch, are you thinking in terms of this is a political pitch for this specific
I see. Not really, but I don't know, I think other people feel this way. If I play solo, right, I don't like playing pieces. I like to have nothing prepared at all, because then you can just really be inspired to follow, and one note informs the next, and then you form an idea, and you go, oh, I like that idea, and you move it, and then you shift. I like to have that flow. But I would argue that any act to strive towards individualism, to strive towards your truth, to empower your own voice is a political act, you know. And so that is probably goes into the arena of the perception of what you're doing. And so that's how come I like that image of different layers of perception. Is it separate piles of sand, or is it the landscape? You encompass it all. And so if you felt that in the play, you know, I mean, I think sometimes I think I was listening to this singer, I forgot her name, but she was saying she always wrote her songs from this condition of when she was a single mom and she was broke and all that. All her songs come from there, you know. And so I thought that's kind of interesting. Where does mine come from? And sometimes I think my sound comes from the voice my parents didn't have. You know, that's probably the inner cry of the sound, psychologically. That's my crusade. Because, you know, now that they're gone, I think about, you know, like anybody, what did they get in life? What did they want? What disappointed them? And all that. And so I think of all the things that they struggled with. And so I think that's probably something to do with it. I think that's probably true of a lot of musicians.
Did they get to hear your music when you know?
My father didn't hear the opera. He passed the year before. He came and heard me after he had one of his strokes. He just got on a bus to hear me play some midnight set, the Blue Note.
Wow.
Because he didn't know what the hell I was doing with my life, you know.
Wow.
You know, and it was really strange. you know, he was not physically able to do it, but he would do that. He would kind of have his mind over matter and go, I'm going. And then my sister had to drop everything and meet him in Port Authority and get him. And then he came, and there's like 4 people in the audience. And one of them was John Perellis, and he wrote my only full feature review in the New York Times at the time.
Wow.
So it was some type of powerful kind of event, you know,
Yeah.
for like 4 people in the audience, and one was John Perellis. So
That's pretty good, yeah.
never happened again. So yeah.
Wow.
But, well, I want to thank everybody. You know, thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Like I said, Arts for Arts has been really central in my life, and a lot of the musicians, not only for the opportunities they've given me to play and develop, but for all the people I've been able to hear and meet at the festivals and in the series. So, you know, talking about empowerment, we have to try to empower Arts for Art, and if you're able to, you know, help them with funding, because the money goes to good use to keep creativity alive.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for coming.